Today's presentation, Bridging the Gap, Securing Working Forests for Future Generations, is the second in a mini-series focusing on domestic forest finance and sustainable forest management. Our speaker, Brian Dangler, is director of the New Forest Fund at the Conservation Fund in Chapel Hill. Brian will describe how the New Forest Fund protects and sustainably manages threatened forests to deliver financial, social, and ecological benefits at large scales. Brian will provide case studies of how his program implements innovative forest finance strategies for conservation of high-priority working forest land, and he will highlight goals of the New Forest Fund in 2014 and beyond. Brian Dangler is an expert forest land acquisition and finance with more than 20 years of experience. He has worked at the Conservation Fund since 2008. Brian holds an MBA from Thomas College and both a Master's and Bachelor's of Forestry from the State University of New York. A few quick reminders. The 60-minute webinar will be recorded and made available through iTunes U, and a copy of the presentation will be made available on the CBAY website under the Outreach tab. The presentation will be approximately 30 to 40 minutes and will be followed by a question and answer session. Please see the question box below and type in your questions during the presentation. We will relay your questions to Brian at the conclusion of his talk. I would like at this point to hand it over to you, Brian.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Tommy, for the opportunity to present the Conservation Fund's New Forest Fund concept for providing a bridge to protecting the nation's working forests of high conservation value. First, a little bit of background for the Conservation Fund, for those of you who don't know. We're a national environmental land and water conservation nonprofit. We have a dual mission for both land and water conservation as well as compatible economic development. We've been around for about 28 years now, and in that time we've conserved over 7 million acres throughout the nation. We're most notable probably for what we are not. The fund is not an advocacy group. We're not a membership organization. We are, however, very efficient. We're lightly staffed. We have about 140 people throughout the country. We try to keep our low overhead very low, and we don't have our own agenda. We work on our partners' priorities. So I'll keep stressing during today's webinar that the decisions we make are based in concert with the priorities of our partners, not ourselves. We're currently rated A+ by Charity Watch as the top environmental nonprofit in the nation. We're very proud of that. And the background slide you see there is a mountain lion on one of our game cameras in our Garcia River forest in California. We like to catch these big species of concern on our cameras, and you'll see a few more, I think, during the presentation. We have a couple other initiatives besides the New Forest Fund that use the power of markets for conservation purposes. I'll touch on them lightly at the end of the presentation. They include both our Land Conservation Loan Program and our Natural Capital Investment Fund, which provides small businesses with a source of capital they wouldn't ordinarily qualify for from traditional lenders. So let's start talking about the topic of the day, the New Forest Fund. Working forests are vital to our nation's economy as well as to our health for the ecosystem services they provide. As we all know, forests don't normally get the attention they might deserve for providing this source of clean water and air and the multitude of social benefits. The forest products industry is larger than the automotive industry in America, but it gets little attention. Estimates vary, but greater than 50 million acres of private working forests are projected to be fragmented or converted by 2030, so the threat to our America's working forest is real. This background picture is taken from a fire tower looking over our 12,000-acre East Grand Lake working forest in southern Aroostook County, Maine. We're kind of looking southeasterly towards New Brunswick in the springtime. So why do we need the New Forest Fund? Until the 1990s, the large working forests have been predominantly owned by the manufacturers, like Georgia Pacific or International Paper perhaps. They own these forests as a reliable source of raw material and as a way to control prices for that raw material. That land ownership was relatively stable for 100 years or so, and the big companies worked pretty well with the conservation interests, especially towards the end of their tenure, to protect sensitive lands. As we all know, that changed very quickly in the late 90s, early 2000s. Now the large working forests are primarily owned by investors seeking short-term profits. The result has been a rapid change in ownership and an accelerated pace of fragmentation and conversion to other uses. Having worked for International Paper in their land sales department, I was part of that acceleration. We created the New Forest Fund in 2008 as a buy and hold strategy for getting ahead of this pace of forest land conversion, in part because we have a solid foundation at the fund of experience in conserving large working forests throughout the country and managing during that whole time. That's especially evident in our 75,000 acres of redwood forests in California, managing them for about 10 years now. Plus, it's a great example of combining both the economic and environmental objectives so we fulfill our dual-purpose charter. The essence of the New Forest Fund model is to buy and hold for the amount of time necessary for the permanent conservation solutions to happen. As a general rule, the land will then be resold to the private timber market, and the money will roll into new forest acquisition targets. So we had this idea. Now let's talk about how we set this goal. You'll see it on the slide, 1 million acres in 10 to 15 years using $200 million of capital. In about 2008, we went through a process of calculating the amount of sensitive forest land that was predicted to churn back into the market. And we also, on the other side of the equation, looked at the availability of traditional agency funding for conservation easements, both federal and state and local. So we set this goal of growing the New Forest Fund into a $200 million revolving fund. That means it doesn't sink into the ground, it keeps growing like a snowball, so that we could conserve 1 million acres of forest land in that time period. So we started officially around 2009, and to date we have around 250,000 acres acquired in 12 different states. And we'll touch on it a little bit later, but we acquired these lands using a combination of grants, low-interest loans, and other innovative financing approaches as we can layer into each acquisition project. Here's a map of presently. It says November 2013, but it's about the same. You'll see we're in all the 5 major timber growing regions of the country, and that diversity helps breed stability, as we all learn in college, and it comes to the fore here in forest land acquisition and holding, because mostly our expenses during the hold period are covered by operations in timberland management. And as we all know, the timberland pricing for products varies throughout the country, and it varies different in different places. So we might have very low prices in the western area of the country, but hopefully we'll have compensating pricing structures in some place like we're currently enjoying in the southeast. So we have some diversity, and that helps us manage our risk. Some of these properties we owned, meaning the Conservation Fund owned them before the New Forest Fund got its start, but we rolled them all into our forest management system, built a portfolio that we can use to leverage future growth. We got started in late 2009 with a donation, our favorite kind, of 3,000 acres in Pennsylvania. Have been growing at an accelerating rate ever since. It's important for us to understand that that growth will be episodic with fits and starts. We're in the private acquisition negotiation market where we may be at auction competing against other timberland investors to acquire a property, and that may happen very quickly within a matter of 30, 60, 90 days. And we're also at the same time negotiating for up to several years with landowners that have patience to negotiate with us for that time period. So our growth is going to be, and our acquisition pace is going to be dictated by the availability of deals we can get on a good business perspective. You'll see on the slide the logos of the Forest Stewardship Council and as well as the Sustainable Forestry Initiative. The lands we do hold and manage are certified and audited under both those auspices. We can talk about that a little bit later. This slide talks a little bit about the three major sources of our money. We seek to raise capital through charitable contributions, primarily foundation grants. We also utilize low-interest loans, below market loans where we can find them. And we have other innovative financing approaches such as the new market tax credit financing through the U.S. government that helps bridge capital to areas of the country that are underserved financially. So this bridge capital, we hope to be able to deploy it around the nation in those forests of high conservation value that become threatened, and we can buy the time for the permanent conservation to happen. And all the while we're holding these properties, we can contribute to the local economies and not take them off the tax rolls and keep them in production. This slide is an interesting perspective from another new forest fund investment in northeastern, New Hampshire, looking from the Appalachian Trail towards our Success Pond property, about 9,000 acres. It would be nice to be up there on a day like today. The most important cog in this machine, I think, it's pretty important to realize. We have, of this 140 staff we talked about, important for us to have these local real estate staff members that we employ to have the relationships, not on the local level, in the local partner level, to get these deals done in the most efficient manner and according to our partners' priorities, again, not ours. So we have a lightly staffed structure of people around the country that are helping us target these acquisitions, manage relationships during the whole time, and then manage the outsale scheme, whether it be to resell an easement to an agency partner, which is really the simplest model, or we may have to layer in an investment by a private conservation buyer who might buy a property and permanently ease the property and own it in perpetuity as a private investment. Or it may be to an agency partner, perhaps not for exactly a working forest conservation easement, but it may involve some fee acquisition, some fee simple ownership of an agency. For instance, a state wildlife management area may want to add to their holdings and manage that timber for habitat and wildlife management access for hunting. We're doing that in West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Alabama, and Louisiana at the moment. But primarily we're working with agency partners, be them federal or state, to place a permanent working forest easement that allows usually recreation, extinguishes the subdivision potential and conversion into developments, limits that, and ensures that that important working forest remains available for the local regional economies. A little bit about the process of our acquisition and hold strategy. This schematic shows three major portions, the acquisition, management, and disposition phases. Starting with the acquisition, we generally target tracts of 10,000 acres in size to make sure we have an economy of scale. As I said before, we make sure it's a priority for a conservation partner. We don't do a project that is appealing primarily to us. It primarily has to be appealing to a partner, whether it be state, local, or federal. And then we have to make sure that we have the financing to get the acquisition done. During the management time, we have to make sure that the property is going to cash flow positively. As I said before, the money doesn't get sunk into the ground. These investments have to pencil out so that they're attractive on a net present value perspective to be able to invest in this property, provide a return to those people that we have promised to return to, albeit small, and then revolve that money into the next deal. So you see in the management box in the middle, we have forest planning that happens. I have mentioned the certification process through the forest audits of Forest Stewardship Council or the Sustainable Forestry Initiative. And then we have ongoing operations, which I'll touch on a slide or two beyond this one. And then finally, the disposition phase, where we wind in the conservation easement or out sale of a fee simple sale, and then wind that property back into private ownership and revolve the money back to the beginning to the next project. Steps in analysis for us. When we look at a target, well, we got to make sure that there's a permanent conservation outcome that is probable in the whole time, which we estimate in the beginning, typically from 5 to 7 years for us, maybe longer, hopefully will be shorter. So in all of these working for us, we have to analyze the timber inventory that's either provided by the seller, or we have to supplement that with our own timber inventory and do an audit or check crews. We have to be very cognizant of the local timber market as we plug those values into our models. If it's, for instance, a very stable market, we can have more confidence. If there's an unstable market, whether it be pulp, saw timber, chips, biomass, any kind of forest products, we have to be very cognizant of the local markets. We do a third-party appraisal on the land to make sure we're investing smartly. We do our own and sometimes third-party forest modeling, so we'll grow and simulate that forest growth into perpetuity, do a discounted cash flow analysis, a DCF value analysis, all bringing us down to a number we can feel comfortable with. And then this is very typical of any acquisition that any investor would do if they were to hire a timber investment firm to analyze their acquisition for them. We'd have to pick a discounted cash flow rate with which to pull back all the future values to present value. There's some magic involved with that, but we take the best advice from the financial experts that we can draw on to make a good determination. All this goes into a pro forma business analysis, just as if you were investing in any other business. And then we negotiate, close the deal, and then manage the property against that pro forma business analysis. So each of these forested tracts that we, in quotes, invest in, the performance of these investments, so to speak, is matched against this pro forma business plan. For instance, how did we do relative to how we expected we would do? So once we have a forest acquired, we typically hire a local forestry consultant, usually the person or people that managed the land before we bought it. And they manage timber sales, they manage leases, recreational leases, for instance. They work with our local staff to get the objectives of the local government satisfied, whether it be sustaining the tax base of property taxes or cash flow from severance taxes, for instance, from harvesting timber. We do the forest management plans, which are incorporated into the certification processes I mentioned earlier. That may include audits in the field. We sometimes do carbon sales. For instance, we have most of our California lands registered with California Protocol. It's a big part of our business. It allows us to do a lot of restoration work with the cash flow. For instance, those redwood forests are kind of in the younger stages of growth. It makes a great candidate for a carbon play to sell to the private carbon market. And we use those funds to reinvest into the land building, stabilizing roads, for instance, increasing the quality of the salmon rearing habitat in the streams, etc. As a policy, we pay all local taxes. Oftentimes, environmental groups or NGOs that are in an ownership position do not pay taxes, as is their prerogative as status of a nonprofit. We take pride in the fact that we always do. We try to leave the property a little better than when we started. So, for instance, the road upgrades, the habitat restoration projects, we work with government agencies and local schools to do those kind of things when appropriate. I'm going to jump into now a couple of case studies. The first one is the picture you saw from the Appalachian Trail back a few slides ago. We call that the Success Pond, New Hampshire tract. Now I'm just going to buzz over to a picture of a map that you'll see and get oriented here. The project we're talking about is Success Pond, and it's the yellow in the rhombus-looking, I'm not sure the name of the geometric shape of that tract, but it says Forest Legacy 3 pending, kind of in yellow. That's about 9,000 acres, and you'll see it's providing a conserved area protection corridor beginning in the south from the White Mountain National Forest. See all that green in the bottom, and to the west is the White Mountain National Forest. To the right or to the east is the state of Maine. You'll see the Maine-New Hampshire line, vertical line, running about midway to the right of the center of your screen. You'll see some public lands there running along the spine of the Appalachian Trail. And then to the north, if you jump up into the purple areas, you'll see some lands associated with Umbagog National Wildlife Refuge. So we're building this connection between basically the refuge in the north and the White Mountain National Forest to the south. So this tract, about 9,000 acres, is owned by several timber investment management organizations. We were actually working on a conservation easement, and we had a contract to buy a conservation easement from the seller, and we had applied for U.S. Forest Service Forest Legacy funding for an easement, which the state would hold. And during that time frame, the landowner got anxious to sell, and luckily we had the New Forest Fund program up and running, so we were able to convert that contract for a conservation easement to a contract for purchase and sale. So we bought the property, and then we started our own Forest Legacy application process with us as the landowner, and it gave it the application much kind of a shot in the arm, and we were able to move that up into the ranking of number 2 for 2015. Well, really 2014, but the funding will come in 2015. So we will have funding through the U.S. Forest Service to place a permanent working forest on this property. It'll probably happen next year. And then our idea is to sell this back to the private timber market, to a timber investor, or if the surrounding townships are able to, with our help, put together a funding plan as a community forest, then perhaps the local city, Berlin, New Hampshire, or the county, Coas, or any adjacent town may come up with a plan to have a community forest, which they will own in perpetuity, and be able to, the conservation easement will have bought down a lot of the value of that tract, so they'll be able to get it for a pretty good price, and it'll be there as a working forest to help support the community. So it's important, obviously, visually from the Appalachian Trail. It provides a very large portion of winter deer habitat, deer wintering area, about 2,000 acres. It also has important connections from a motorized recreation standpoint. Snowmobile and ATV trails run through this property, and that portion of that aspect of the management of this property is very important to the local economy. So we think this is a pretty good deal. It's kind of the most simple model that we can think of: sell a working forest easement and bring it back into the private timber market. Again, we could do a community forest if that comes to pass. There's the map again for orientation. And I mentioned the game cameras. This is pretty hard to see, but that's a lynx, and that's crossing a snowmobile trail where there was a game camera on Success Pond Township, Success Pond Tract, and that's pretty cool. Trying to increase the habitat, increase the population as they move down from Canada back into the original footprint of where lynx lived. Very dependent on snowshoe hare as a food source. So the next case study, we call it Rayonier. I'm going to jump to the map again, give you an orientation here, where we are about 30 miles west of Savannah, Georgia. And you'll see the large green area to the north is Fort Stewart Army Base. And you see the other tracks in green are the subject tracks which we have bought. We bought from Rayonier Corporation, a forest products industry heavy hitter. We'll go back up to the slide prior to that. So yeah, about 4,000 acres. We were able to purchase it. It was on private. It was being marketed by a realtor, basically, and 4 different recreational tracts. Typical scheme, trying to maximize their value by breaking up individual tracts and selling them to the retail market. We were able to buy these 5 or 6 tracts in bulk at a bulk price, and we were able to sell, and we've already done this, a working forest easement to Fort Stewart through the compatible use buffer program that the Department of Defense runs. And the idea is to keep development and fragmentation from happening around the base, so that they're able to continue their mission, training basically for maneuvers. They'll be used in real time someday. So we were able to step in and buy this, and we sold an easement to the Georgia Land Trust. They are the local provider of services for the Department of Defense there at Fort Stewart. The easement restricts all subdivision, all future subdivision and development, with the exception of one small building envelope for a camp, basically, for a hunting camp on each of these tracts. So that's helped us remarket the lands. We're also allowed to convert 7% of the total area to wildlife food plots, also helping in the recreational private market. Someone could buy this, put their little camp on it, live with the easement restrictions, forest management restrictions, and be able to recreate to their heart's content. So we were able to do that on 2 of these tracts. I'm going to go back to that map. H.C. Long Wells, you'll see in the top right, we've sold that one to a recreational buyer. H.C. Long Wells 1, we've sold that actually to a sawmill who was interested in holding and operating the timber. And the Durham Banks property, you'll see kind of in the middle, that's an interesting one because we were able to facilitate the sale of this to a community, as a community forest, to a local economic development organization in Darien, Georgia, by the name of McIntosh Seed. We're in the process of transferring the property to them. They will use that to generate revenue for their economic development programs through sustainable timber harvest. And they're talking about harvesting things like grass to make baskets for local craftspersons, and even some silvopastoral practices. I guess you'll have some pasturing of animals as well as growing trees And so they're going to do a lot of programs and research on this property. And we were able to, by, again, selling down the value partially through a sale of an easement, we were able to get this to them, facilitate the transfer to Macintosh Seed for a pretty good price, so they can make this happen. The Walker McDowell tract straight to the north, that one we haven't sold yet, but we will. It's just about to be fully eased. The lighter green needs to be eased. We have to find the funding for that. Once it is, that's going to be about a 2,000, a little more than 2,000 acre tract. It's very attractive as a straight timber investment. So it'll most likely attract a private timber investor. Again, to be fully protected in perpetuity. So this is a good example of buying in bulk, selling an easement on the whole, all the tracts, and then being able to sell them out into different end users, fully protected. The grant funder on this particular project has a restriction that the money stay in Georgia. So we're in the process of trying to find a new acquisition target for that money. Well, I'm trying to change the screen and I'm stuck. A technical difficulty here. Apologize. Yeah, I am totally frozen. So I think what I'll do is have you use your imagination for the rest of it. I'm almost done, luckily. I've got a few more topics to touch on, then we'll wrap it up. So the reintegration of the forest industry back with the conservation aspects of land, that's really what we're all about. Through the New Forest Fund concept, we're trying to keep working forests going for not only the economic, local economic impact that working forests provide, but also to obviously permanently protect the conservation values of working forests. So that's kind of the nutshell wrap up of that. I wanted to do a little shout out to those two other programs that I mentioned at the beginning. The first one is the Land Conservation Loan Program. We are currently capitalized at $50 million, and we provide loans to partner organizations that need bridge financing. For instance, they're waiting for a donor or a government agency to fund their project, but they need money quickly from us, and we'll do it. We have a fairly easy turnaround on our loans. Within a month or two, you would know whether you got qualified or not. Pretty easy underwriting underwriting criteria. Pretty good loan rates. We're currently between 2.27 and 3.25. So if any of your local land trusts are in the market for bridge financing, we have this Land Conservation Loan Program. We'd love to talk to them about it. And we also have the Natural Capital Investment Fund, which is kind of a green business lending arm of TCF, about 10 years old. And we have competitive rates for loans up to $500,000 in Central Appalachia and the Southeast. We also have smaller microloans under $50,000 that can be used nationwide and often in partnership with other lenders like a bank. This would supplement and be subservient to those loans. It can be used for equipment, working capital, inventory, anything you need to keep a business running that has a kind of a resource-based flavor to it. We lend to sawmills and loggers and flooring and molding and veneer manufacturers, biomass utilizers, that kind of thing. So we'd be glad to talk to anybody about funding that source of those kinds of businesses as well. So that's where I think I'll wrap it up. I apologize for the technical glitch, but I think I've gotten most of it all wrapped up. I'm glad to take any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Brian, for that really thorough explanation of what the New Forest Fund is working on and how you structure your transactions. That was really enlightening. Our first question from the audience As you are completing your discounted cash flow and other analysis on properties, do you find that the land values are lower than when you buy them because of the conservation easements? And if so, are there other improvements of the forest that you target in your management that help increase the value of that land and forest so that your net present value becomes positive?
Well, that's a great question. Yeah, I'll see if I can do it justice. So when we model our acquisition projects using a discounted cash flow analysis method, we do plug in a easement sale. So yes, it devalues, it has a negative impact on the underlying land value, but then it has an associated positive impact on the cash flow. So depending, of course, on the timing, this is all time sensitive, obviously, of those cash flows and the discount rates you choose, assuming that the negative impact that the easement has from selling rights, higher and better use rights, is offset by the easement money coming in, it should be a net positive. So we wouldn't probably do it if it was a net negative, because it would be not a very good investment. So to answer the second part of your question, yes, we do restoration activities. We do really pretty conservative forest management, so that our growth is typically greater than our withdrawals. So at the end of our term, obviously the inventory and the quality of that inventory should be better than when we bought it.
Great, thank you very much for that answer. And our audience has asked a follow-up to that question. What components influence your selection of a discount rate?
Yeah, so discount rate obviously is a proxy for risk, and we have our own internal costs of capital and our own internal rates, which we have opportunity costs and other investments. So we kind of meld that into the greater financial services sector discounts and published discount rates. In particular, we subscribe to the services that that monitor and accumulate DCF discount rate determinations from those in the business, in the forest product sector. I could go on and on and on, but typically in this market environment in the last couple of years, with a very aggressive market for investment-grade timberland, they've generally been running in the 6.5% rates. Those were compressed back in the heyday of the late 2000s, say 2004, 5, 6. Discount rates and timber investments were approaching 4, sometimes sub 4, and that allowed for a very high rate of increase in the bid prices for timberland. So there's been a correction. Whether it'll be back in the 7-8% range, a conservative range, it's hard to tell. The timberland investment market weathered the financial crisis very well. It's a stable investment. It's a real investment, something you can touch. It has a small beta, relatively low return rates, but relatively low risk. So I hope I answered your question.
Great, thank you. And I think that our audience is also really interested in learning a little bit more about community forests. Can you please elaborate on the fund's experience in facilitating aggregation and acquisition for the purpose of community forests? What makes a community forest a success from your perspective?
Sure. Kind of in the, I think, the early stages of the evolution of modern community forests. Obviously, there's been community forests throughout time, and New England, say the Lake States, it's very common to have a local government or a county-owned forests. But the latest wave of having a community forest in places that haven't typically had them, I think we're on the front of that wave right now. There's a little bit of funding through USDA Forest Service for relatively small grants to help. What we're trying to do is use your typical buy down of values through working forest easements to facilitate the purchase of working forests for communities that could benefit from them. A good example is the Hope Community Forest near Fort Bragg in North Carolina. It's actually a tract of land I sold when I was with International Paper to the Conservation Fund. And that's about 450 acres. You could probably find it online. There was a great NPR interview about it. It's been published, and you could probably search and find that fairly quickly. But that's a case where Hoke County had never owned any forest. They were kind of the victim of their big neighbor, Fort Bragg, and they've never had really any passive recreation of any kind. And so this provides them with a source of revenue for their recreational programs. It also provides a place for people to go and passively recreate or ride horses, to hunt and fish, that kind of thing. It's been converted to Longleaf for the most part, from industrial loblolly pine management to more sustainable longleaf production, which, as probably everybody knows, is the flavor of the day, where it's very popular to convert, try to re-establish at least a portion of the original footprint of longleaf pine, and such an important habitat and as well as financial contributor to the South's economy. And so this is being converted slowly back to longleaf pine. And one of the positive financial aspects of longleaf pine during its early stages is that it produces very good mulch. The long needles are able to enjoy a very good market for landscape improvements. So I think it's around age 10 they're predicting they'll be able to rake straw, something like $100 per acre per year. I might have that figure wrong, of net profit to the owner for raking and selling pine straw. So there's the financial aspects that are good for the community. There's the obviously the health benefits from people being able to recreate on this community forest, and we're proud to be associated with it. If you could look at that video, I've touched on things I remember, but certainly there's a lot more to it, and we're in the early stage of replicating that. I mentioned two options here, one in New Hampshire, one in Georgia, where we hope to facilitate something different. Obviously, every one project is going to be very different, like a snowball. So, pretty exciting stuff.
Great, thank you so much for that answer. Brian, do you have a target or average time between when the fund buys and then sells properties and easements, and what are the biggest risks you face in your business in general?
Yeah, so we generally model 5 to 7 year hold period. If we have intelligence that makes that prediction compressed, we might knock a few years off of that. We try to be conservative and budget more time. Obviously, the sooner the better for our investment risk, our investment profile, and being able to roll this money into new projects. So, for instance, the Rayonier Fort Stewart project I mentioned earlier, we were able to sell an easement on that within 6 months, and we didn't think that was going to happen. So that was great news. So we were able to turn that around faster than we had predicted. So that has a positive impact on the whole project, obviously. The greatest risks are really from a conservation funding plan perspective. So, for instance, say the Success Pond tract we talked about in New Hampshire, 9,000 acres. We kind of speculated on buying that property with the expectation that a U.S. Forest Service Forest Legacy easement funding project would come to pass. It came to pass within a couple of years. We were fortunate. And as everybody probably knows, that's a competitive process, and even beyond that, it's something that could be wiped out from the president's budget very easily with a stroke of a pen. So we're taking the risk that the easement, the public funding, may not actually occur. We're buying the time for it to occur, the facilitation of time, but it may not occur. Then if it doesn't, we have to try to find an alternative source of funding for an easement. That may be a private conservation buyer, maybe a lot of different things. Hopefully we're not faced with that dilemma very often, but we probably will be, and time will tell. It's really a little early. We wouldn't. We're probably 2 or 3 years into this. We wouldn't start giving up on the success of a property, or starting to think about alternative disposition, and finding conservation outcomes that that didn't come to fruition like we thought they would until probably year 10.
Great, thank you. And Brian, you mentioned in one of the deals an outsale component of the Forest Legacy easement, and are you able to elaborate a little bit on the role of ongoing federal programs in your transactions and what expected opportunities you have in the next 5 years within the Farm Bill for funding?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I probably can't talk very skillfully or intelligently about numbers or expectations versus reality, but I think we were all with the impasses from the federal budgeting side over the last several years. There were several bills associated with the Land and Water Conservation Fund being eliminated or defunded. That would very severely impact a lot of our business. The Farm Bill, as everybody knows, has been a source of contention, hung up on milk at the moment. So, yeah, we've kind of run worst-case scenarios where none of this federal funding comes to pass, and what do we do? How do we get out of our projects? How do we make sure the conservation happens? And it involves primarily, alternative funding sources like state and local, and a little bit of private funding that could backfill. Not preferable. It would probably take a lot more time, probably more incremental. So that's a lot of, when we model an acquisition project, we obviously run worst case and best case and most likely case scenarios, and so we have to kind of take all those ranges of results into consideration. Luckily, there's a budget passed, a 2-year budget has passed, and that provides some welcome certainty to some programs that we've been uncertain about for several years now.
Great, thank you very much. Brian, how do you incorporate social, financial, and ecological benefits into your forest management plans? And do the buyers of your forest land have to agree to abide by your management recommendations upon purchase?
Yeah, great question. So that's part of our dual forest stewardship council and sustainable forestry initiative certification process. As everybody's familiar with those processes, the forest management planning is very exhaustive, and the attention to detail for social, cultural aspects as well beyond economic aspects is incorporated in all of these plans, and we're a required post these forest management plans online, so you'd be able to dig around and find them. You can certainly find our coastal redwood California plans out there. So we try to use that forest stewardship and sustainable forestry initiative dual certification process to make sure we address those aspects of the through the planning process. And I'm trying to think of the second part of that question. Could you remind me, please?
The second part of the question was about the buyers of your properties that you're holding. Do they have to abide by your management plans?
Yes. So typically, the forest management plans are created by the current forest land holder. So in some cases, I guess the answer is it depends. So in some cases, the working forest easement is going to require certification. So the next owner, if they have to certify the lands like we did, pretty good chance it's going to be very close. Some instances, for instance, the Fort Stewart, Georgia property I mentioned earlier, that working forest easement does not require certification. It's probably impractical for, say, a 200-acre recreational owner to have their property certified unless they're going to go under a group certification that's sponsored by a big paper mill or something like that. So there is a forest management planning requirement within the terms of the easement, and it basically stipulates protection zones around sensitive areas, and it gives the easement holder, in this case it's the Georgia-Alabama Land Trust, an opportunity to review any forest management activities, because they have to submit a forest management plan, I think, and update it every, 5 years. So the answer really is it depends, and each case is going to be handled a little bit differently.
Great, thank you very much for explaining that a little bit more. In structuring your acquisitions, what percentage of the capital is sourced from grants and philanthropy versus private investment?
Oh, well, I wish I had that off the top of my head. The majority, let's say it's roughly half foundation grants to alternatives, and the alternatives, as I listed before, include lending from philanthropies, loans to program-related investments, financing through water boards or through lending arms that work with conservation entities, for instance in California. The new market tax credit financing package that we've done in East Grand Lake requires us to use collateral in other parts of our or other ownerships in the country as collateral for a 7-year commitment on that financing structure, which provides somewhat of a subsidy to the rate in exchange for economic impacts to underserved rural communities. So I'm going to give you a stock answer of about half right now, but I'm really not positive.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for the approximation. So our audience is also curious to know that as a national organization, how does, in the Conservation Fund, how does your specific New Forest Fund define regional priorities across the U.S.?
Well, I think I'm going to have to go back for that answer to say the Conservation Fund itself does not have regional priorities. As I stated, our whole model is based on partner priorities. So we have different focuses in different regions of the country, but they're really keyed off of our partners' priorities themselves. So, for instance, the Department of Defense has a priority ranking for which bases are important for them for protection, for land acquisition, prioritization. We tend to go where their priorities are in that respect. Same goes to the National Wildlife Refuge System. Right now, the pothole prairie section of the country is getting most of the attention. A little bit in the lower Mississippi River Valley, not so much in some of the other areas where we're doing, we have acquisition targets for working forests. So I guess the quick answer is the fund itself, the conservation fund, doesn't have any priorities, and any regional priorities we have would be really a function of our agency partners.
Great, thank you very much. Brian, what are some of your challenges in regenerating and transitioning forests from industrial scale management to sustainable paradigms with more variable retention harvests and more diverse species distribution?
Well, the biggest challenge is cash flow. So typically, the industrial model of short rotation, high intensity management, I'm talking mostly for the Southeast right now, is the most economically efficient model. So when we slow down that model and, for instance, plant longleaf with a 50 to 70 year rotation length versus 25 to 30 years, that has an impact on the investment model. So that has to come from somewhere, either from a lower expectation from us on an out sale, a lower investment on the front end, or from some kind of subsidization in the middle. So we do benefit from some, although we don't qualify for a lot of incentive grants and that kind of thing to help us with restoration. And I think probably the best answer is to say, because in most cases we're cutting less than growth and we're rebuilding the inventory, letting some of these tracts heal, so to speak, because we have a lower cost of capital than a private investor would, it gives us a little bit more flexibility to be less heavy-handed.
Great, thank you so much. Brian, are you able to speak to your personal and professional outlook on the potential for emerging environmental markets such as forest carbon or water quality Tmdls and their role to provide an additional funding stream for your group?
Yeah, I'll try. So we're working in a lot of places, especially big cities like Raleigh-Durham, where they recognize that water quality and quantity is vital to their future. And so, for instance, the Raleigh-Durham Water Authority is tacking on a little bit to everybody's bill. Some of that money is going to be used directly for land conservation. I think that's a small step. I think that model is going to be replicated, and it already has been in certain parts of the country. People are going to really recognize the importance of forests to their water, to their being, to their life. That connection really hasn't been made for the typical American yet. So I think over time that connection needs to be made and will be made, and then there will be more importance placed on the filtration and water quantity aspects of having upstream forests. Atlanta, I think it just has to do something in that regard. So I think that'll happen. We're seeing some real-time changes in the carbon markets. Of course, the Chicago Climate Exchange didn't work, but the expansion of the California model, they're able to have projects outside of California. That's having an impact, I think. I think having a positive impact on conserving working forests if someone's able to layer a carbon scheme on top of their investment model and essentially conserve that property during that time period, whether it be a 99-year commitment or a permanent easement, which will increase the carbon stocks on that property and essentially have positive ecological impacts as a fallout from that. So I see water and carbon coming on pretty strong, hopefully sooner than later.
It's very encouraging. Thank you for sharing that. And we'd like to end with one last question, a little bit broader. Can you speak to your overall progress toward the 1 million acres goal? And what's your greatest challenge to reaching this huge monumental milestone?
Sure. Well, we're about 25% of the way there. Uh, our biggest challenge really is finding capital. So funding this fund, we're off to a pretty good start, but we've got a long ways to go. So recruiting and retaining funding sources. Hopefully this, our good out of the gate track record will attract additional capital, because the beauty of this is it continues to snowball into new projects. It's not like say a grant, a $5 million grant, is attributable to one project and that's over. Theoretically, it could go on forever. So and leave a trail of millions of acres of virgin forests impacted throughout the nation.